Well, the U.S. has agreed to a temporary ceasefire. The truce proposed by Pakistan comes just ahead of a deadline Mr. Trump had set for Tehran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
Washington says it will halt attacks and further bombardment on Iran for 2 weeks if Iran agrees to reopen the critical oil channel. Iran's top diplomat Abbas Araghchi says passage through the waterway will be allowed for 2 weeks under its military management. And Bohl is senior Middle East and North Africa analyst at RANE. He joins us once again. Ryan, great to see you. So I'm wondering what you make of this extension. 2 weeks, I mean, is this a genuinely good deal in the eyes of the Trump administration and President Trump? Or is this more about Trump looking for relief for oil prices, for markets and so forth?
I think it's both sides looking to take pressure off of one another and their vulnerabilities. For Trump, it's clear that his political will for this kind of war was always limited. We just didn't know exactly how long he would hold out. But this early April deadline was one of the more baseline assumptions, is that he would only be able to continue this for 30 to 60 days before his own political instincts would tell him that he needed to find an exit. So that makes some sense on the Trump administration's front, because now it's going to take away some of that pressure on the oil front, on the economic front, even his own base. Some of his own base supporters were calling for the 25th Amendment, which is the procedure by which you remove a president from power on social media today. There was a really big fracture within his base. Now, on the Iranian side, of course, they've had significant damage done to them. They've had assassinations. They've used up a large amount of their missile and rocket arsenal, and they've alienated virtually all of their neighbors. So a de-escalation, at least temporary, makes sense to them. But there are huge gaps between the two sides in what they're saying to one another. The Iranians have a 10-point plan, which is very maximalist. It's including things like controlling the Strait of Hormuz long-term and having reparations for the war, while the U.S. is saying that Hormuz is going to be open and free and back to the status quo ante before the war, and that the Iranians are eventually going to give up their nuclear program. So they're talking past each other, but at the very least, they've agreed for the next 2 weeks to take the heat off of what was looking like a spiraling military situation.
But, I mean, it's been over, an hour or so since Mr. Trump announced that pause, yet attacks are still being reported. Just how fragile is the ceasefire right now?
I would describe it as highly fragile, and it'll be subject to the whims of President Trump, who will be the prime actor who can re-escalate. There is an open question as to whether or not the Iranians, or at least elements of the Iranian system, see an advantage in continuing to carry out sporadic attacks during this time period in order to keep up that economic pressure on Trump, to signal that they have capabilities and that they can continue to cause harm in the course of those negotiations. It's hard to say that the entire Iranian system is going to go pause as a result of this ceasefire agreement. So I would say it is highly fragile, and especially once Trump starts to see some of the Iranian demands, will he be told that these demands are something America can't work with, or is it something that America has to accept? And in particular, it's the status of the Strait of Hormuz that I'm looking at. The Iranians seem to believe that it is now their domain, that it's something that they will be able to control and charge tolls for indefinitely. Will Trump accept that? I think we still have to wait and see.
So given what you just said, Ryan, I mean, are you surprised that Iran actually agreed to consider reopening the straits, at least for 2 weeks, the duration of the ceasefire, and talk about perhaps what the future may look like for the strait?
To an extent, I am. I tended to believe the Iranians wanted the conflict to continue for at least a few more weeks to cause lasting economic harm to the United States. And the rationale behind that is the more economic harm, the more political harm, the less likely the next war, because they are assuming that the Americans and the Israelis are reloading. They are not de-escalating. So I am a bit surprised in terms of the timing, but it did make sense that they would accept the first American offer for a significant ceasefire, because this does allow them to claim victory, and it also allows them to reorganize themselves on that military front, which after all has been disrupted significantly. And I think Pakistan's role can't be overlooked here. Pakistan technically does have a defense pact with the Saudis. It hasn't been activated. It might not be very effective. But the Iranians, the last thing they wanted was to alienate their neighbor on their eastern land border. And they were also worried about the Chinese. And there are reports from the outlets like the New York Times that China's influence was significant in this process, where they were putting a lot of pressure on the Iranians to accept this ceasefire, because after all, a lot of this oil from both the Gulf and from the Iranians goes to China.
Just looking at Iran, it's already claiming victory, saying the U.S. accepted its terms. Could this ceasefire actually strengthen their hand and weaken Mr. Trump's leverage going forward?
It is entirely possible. We have a black box in terms of Iran's political dynamics right now with all the assassinations and the control on information. But if the Iranians are able to spin this into a heroic narrative of resistance, which is what they're doing right now, and they can get at least part of the Iranian population to believe in it, and they find a way to carry out reconstruction at scale, potentially through these tolls, potentially through a longer-term diplomatic deal that sees at least partial sanctions relief, that would strengthen the Islamic Republic in the long term. It also is a question of how the Islamic Republic decides to position itself on the global stage geopolitically. Do they deepen their military integration with the Russians and the Chinese, or their economic integration with these great powers? And doing something like that would give them greater resiliency and a greater ability to reconstruct themselves. On the other hand, if they decide to stay on their sovereignty path, where they're trying to chart an independent path, it'll be a lot harder to repair the damage caused by this war, and therefore the Iranian people themselves will eventually run out of patience for putting up with a government that can't rebuild a war that it may not have conclusively won.
And I want to be realistic here. During, the 2 weeks when they're supposed to be talking in Pakistan, is it also correct to assume that Iran will be trying to rebuild its military, put forces back in place, perhaps, overlooking the Strait of Hormuz once again, and the U.S. will be doing likewise, rearming, perhaps bringing in, fresh reinforcements, and both would be ready, should it be necessary, to resume the conflict, the war?
I would expect both sides would be doing that, especially the Iranians as best they can with their the supply chains to the Russians especially. But we've already seen a great deal of U.S. military aircraft are still heading into the region, C-17s, and reports of an artillery brigade out of Arkansas. So there are still troops moving out into the Middle East. And the idea is that the Pentagon is still preparing options for further escalation. These aren't ironclad indicators that the U.S. is going to resume the war in the future, but it is a strong indicator that the U.S. is prepared to resume the war if these negotiations don't work out. And I think what I'm concerned about here is that even if we get through the 2-week deadline and we're able to kind of limp along with these ceasefires, that's how this region has often worked, where ceasefires are limped along until the combatants are able to fight one another again. We saw this time and time again in Syria. We've certainly seen it plenty of times between Israel and Hamas and Gaza. And the Iranians may be now in the similar dynamic where they're simply preparing for the next war. It's certainly how the Israelis are viewing the situation. They see it as something temporary. 2 weeks might be kicked down until after the midterms in November or even longer, but they're certainly preparing for the next war with Iran.
Ryan, always a pleasure. Thank you very much. Ryan Bohl is Senior Middle East and North Africa Analyst at RANE.